I'm going to leave you with nothing, you useless old hag." The words slithered out of Samantha's perfectly glossed lips as she leaned close during the court recess. I held up my phone and smiled sweetly. "Your Honor, may I play a video of her from last night? If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from." The color drained from Samantha's Botoxed face faster than water down a drain. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow from the bench. "Mrs. Mitchell, please return to your seat. We'll address any new evidence after the break. My name is Dorothy Mitchell, though most folks call me Dot. I'm 68 years old, and until 8 months ago, I thought I knew my daughter-in-law pretty well. Turns out, I didn't know her at all. 3 days earlier, I'd been sitting in this same courthouse, listening to Samantha's lawyer paint me as a scheming old woman who'd manipulated my dying son into changing his will. According to her lawsuit, I'd somehow brainwashed my Michael into leaving me his house, his savings, and his life insurance policy. The nerve of that woman, sitting there in her designer black dress, the same one she'd worn to his funeral, playing the grieving widow. "My client has reason to believe the will was forged," her attorney had announced dramatically. Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell had both motive and opportunity to manipulate a grieving man in his final moments. I'd watched from the gallery as 12 jurors hung on every word. Samantha dabbed her eyes with a tissue, the picture of devastation. She was good, I'll give her that. 20 years in pharmaceutical sales had taught her how to sell anything, even lies wrapped in crocodile tears. But here's the thing about being 68. You develop a sixth sense for people who aren't what they seem. And my son's wife? She'd been setting off my radar for months before Michael died. The judge had scheduled this hearing to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed with Samantha's contest of the will. She needed to prove I'd coerced Michael somehow, that he wasn't in his right mind when he'd updated his estate plan 6 weeks before the accident. What she didn't know was that I had insurance of my own, the kind that would make her wish she'd never met my family. As the bailiff called us back to order, I caught Samantha's eye and winked. 24 hours ago, I'd been ready to roll over and let her have whatever she wanted. Grief does that to you, makes you tired, makes you willing to take the path of least resistance. But that was before I'd seen the video. The phone call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I remember because I was staring at the digital clock on my nightstand, wondering if the chest pain was heartburn or something worse. At my age, you never know. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The voice was young, professional, carefully neutral. "This is Officer Bradley with the state police. I'm calling about your son, Michael." I'd always known this call would come someday. Not because Michael was reckless, quite the opposite. My boy was the careful type, always wore his seatbelt, never drank and drove, kept his car maintained like clockwork. But he traveled for work, spent half his life on highways between client meetings. Statistics catch up with everyone eventually. "There's been an accident," Officer Bradley continued. "I'm sorry to inform you that Michael was killed instantly when a semi-truck ran a red light at the intersection of Route 15 and Miller Road." The funny thing about devastating news is how your brain tries to reject it at first. I heard the words, understood their meaning, but some part of me kept insisting there'd been a mistake. Not my Michael, not my baby boy who called every Sunday, who still brought me flowers on Mother's Day, who'd never missed one of my birthday dinners. Samantha arrived at the hospital before I did. She was already in full widow mode when I walked into the family waiting room, mascara running, clutching Michael's wedding ring like a sacred relic. She fell into my arms, sobbing, and for a moment, I forgot all my reservations about her. "He's really gone, Dot," she whispered against my shoulder. "I can't believe he's really gone." I held her tight, this woman I'd never quite warmed to, but had learned to tolerate for Michael's sake. In that moment, we were just two people who'd lost the man we both loved, in our own ways. The funeral planning brought out Samantha's true colors. She wanted everything expensive, elaborate, fitting for a man of Michael's stature. Never mind that my practical son would have rolled his eyes at the $10,000 casket and the symphony quartet she insisted on hiring for the service. "I want people to remember him properly," she'd said when I suggested something simpler. "Michael deserves the best." What Michael deserved was to be remembered for his kindness, his terrible dad jokes, the way he could fix anything with duct tape and determination. But Samantha was writing the checks, so Samantha got her way. The will reading happened 2 weeks after the funeral. Samantha had assumed everything would go to her automatically. The house, the insurance money, the investment accounts Michael had been building since college. Her face when the lawyer read the actual terms was something to behold. I leave my house at 847 Maple Drive to my mother, Dorothy Mitchell, with the hope that she will find comfort there. The lawyer's voice was steady, professional. My life insurance policy and retirement accounts are to be divided equally between my wife Samantha and my mother Dorothy. Samantha's shock was genuine. There must be some mistake, she'd said. We discussed this just last month. Michael said everything would come to me, but there was no mistake. Michael had updated his will 6 weeks before he died, adding me as a beneficiary and changing the house deed entirely. He'd never mentioned it to either of us. That should have been my first clue that my son knew something I didn't. The lawsuit came 3 months after the funeral, delivered by a courier while I was watering the roses Michael had planted for me last spring. The papers were thick, official, and filled with accusations that made my hands shake. Undue influence, mental incapacity, fraudulent manipulation of a vulnerable individual. According to Samantha's legal team, I'd somehow convinced my son to change his will while he was emotionally compromised, following his diabetes diagnosis earlier that year. Never mind that Michael's blood sugar had been perfectly controlled with medication, or that he'd been sharper than ever in his final months. The lawyers painted a picture of a manipulative mother taking advantage of her son's fears about mortality. They claimed I'd pressured him during his weekly visits, convinced him that Samantha was only interested in his money, played on his emotions until he'd rewritten his entire estate plan. It was complete fiction, but it was convincing fiction. Mrs. Mitchell, my attorney, James Worthington, had explained during our first meeting, they don't need to prove their claims beyond a reasonable doubt. This is civil court. They just need to show it's more likely than not that you influenced Michael improperly. James was 72, a family friend who'd handled my late husband's estate years earlier. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patience to explain legal concepts to a woman who'd never been sued by anyone, let alone her own daughter-in-law. The timing works against us, he admitted. 6 weeks before his death, Michael suddenly changes his will dramatically. No history of estate planning changes, no documented disagreements with Samantha, no apparent reason for the modification. But there had been a reason. I just didn't know what it was yet. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in September. Samantha's lawyer, Patricia Grimm, was exactly what you'd expect. Sharp-suited, sharp-tongued, and sharp enough to cut glass with her questions. She'd built her career on contested estates, turning family disagreements into profitable courtroom dramas. Mrs. Mitchell, she'd begun, her voice honey-sweet with undertones of venom. How often did you visit your son in the months before his death? Every Sunday for dinner, I'd answered truthfully. It was our tradition. And during these visits, did you discuss his marriage? Sometimes. No point in lying. Michael had confided in me about the usual marital ups and downs, Samantha's expensive shopping habits, her lack of interest in having children, the way she seemed more invested in their social status than their relationship. Did you ever suggest that Samantha was only interested in his money? I'd paused, remembering conversations I'd tried to forget. I may have expressed concerns. Patricia had smiled then, the expression of a shark sensing blood in the water. Concerns about what, specifically? About whether she truly loved him or just the lifestyle he provided. The truth was, I'd never liked Samantha from the moment Michael brought her home. She was beautiful, charming, and completely wrong for my son. But mothers aren't supposed to say such things, so I'd kept my mouth shut and hoped for the best. Now my honesty was being used as evidence against me. The truth about Samantha came from the most unlikely source, my neighbor's 16-year-old grandson, Tyler. The kid was always fooling around with his drone, flying it over the neighborhood despite the homeowners association's repeated complaints. Mrs. Mitchell? Tyler had appeared at my door 3 days after my deposition, holding his phone with the awkward intensity only teenagers can manage. I think you need to see something. What Tyler showed me changed everything. The video was grainy, shot from above by his drone camera the night before Michael's funeral. Tyler had been testing the drone's night vision capabilities when he'd captured something extraordinary. Samantha in the backyard of what was supposed to be our family's house of mourning, wrapped in the arms of a man who definitely wasn't my dead son. I wasn't trying to spy or anything, Tyler had explained, his face red with embarrassment. I was just flying around after dark because my mom said I couldn't during the day anymore. But when I saw the footage later, the timestamp on the video was damning. 11:47 p.m., less than 12 hours before we'd all stood graveside to bury Michael. While I'd been lying awake grieving, while friends and family had been preparing to say their final goodbyes, Samantha had been having what could only be described as a very intimate conversation with a stranger. "Do you know who the man is?" I'd asked Tyler, rewinding the video to get a better look at the figure. "Yeah, that's Mr. Rodriguez from the insurance office on Main Street. Carlos Rodriguez. My mom gets our car insurance from him. Carlos Rodriguez." The name meant nothing to me, but a quick internet search revealed everything I needed to know. Rodriguez was indeed an insurance agent, but more importantly, he specialized in life insurance policies. His LinkedIn profile boasted about helping clients maximize their coverage and claims. The pieces started falling into place like dominoes. Samantha's insistence on the expensive funeral, her immediate assumption that she'd inherit everything, her quick pivot to challenging the will when she learned about the changes, her confidence that she could prove I'd manipulated Michael. She hadn't just been planning for Michael's death. She'd been planning for what came after. "Tyler," I'd said carefully, "I need you to save this video somewhere safe, and I need you not to tell anyone else about it yet. Can you do that for me?" The boy had nodded solemnly, understanding without explanation that he'd stumbled onto something important. "Should I delete it from the drone?" "Absolutely not. Make copies. Email it to yourself. Put it on a flash drive. This might be the most important video you ever take." Over the next week, I did my own investigation. Carlos Rodriguez had a wife and 2 kids in Springfield, about 30 miles away. His insurance office was a small operation, barely profitable according to public records. He drove a 10-year-old Honda and lived in a modest ranch house with a mortgage that was underwater. In other words, exactly the kind of man who might be tempted by a recently widowed woman with a substantial life insurance payout coming her way. The question was, how long had they been planning this? I spent the next 2 weeks putting together a timeline that would make a detective proud. Bank records, phone logs, social media posts, everything I could legally access about Samantha's activities in the months before Michael's death. What I found painted a picture of a woman who'd been preparing for widowhood with shocking efficiency. 3 months before the accident, Samantha had started seeing a new therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in grief counseling and life transitions. 2 months before, she'd joined a support group for women facing major life changes. 6 weeks before Michael died, she'd updated her own will and life insurance beneficiaries. The same week, Michael had changed his will. James Worthington was fascinated when I brought him my research. "Dorothy, this is remarkable detective work, but we need to be careful how we use it. Some of this could be seen as coincidental." "What about the video?" I'd asked, showing him Tyler's footage on my phone. James had watched it 3 times, adjusting his glasses and squinting at the small screen. "This is significant, but we need to establish when their relationship began. If it started after Michael's death, it doesn't necessarily prove anything about the will." That's when I remembered Samantha's phone. Michael had been old-fashioned about technology, but he'd insisted on sharing phone plans to save money. As the account holder, I still had access to detailed billing records going back 2 years. It took some digging, but I found what I was looking for: regular calls and text messages between Samantha and Carlos Rodriguez starting 8 months before Michael's death. 8 months. Their affair had begun almost immediately after Michael's diabetes diagnosis, when he'd first started talking about updating his estate planning. "This changes everything," James had said when I showed him the phone records. "We can establish a pattern of deception. We can show motive for wanting Michael dead." But I wanted more than just to win the lawsuit. I wanted Samantha to face the consequences of what she'd done. Michael deserved justice, and I was going to make sure he got it. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Samantha's lawyer would present their case for why the will should be overturned, and James would respond with our defense. It was supposed to be a routine proceeding, a chance for the judge to determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. Patricia Grimm had no idea what was coming. I spent the weekend before the hearing practicing my testimony with James. We went over every detail, every question they might ask, every piece of evidence we planned to present. But we saved the video for last. Our nuclear option, the evidence that would destroy Samantha's credibility completely. "Are you sure you want to do this?" James had asked me Sunday night. "Once we play that video in court, there's no going back. Samantha's life will be ruined." I'd thought about Michael, about the man who'd called me every Sunday, who'd brought me soup when I was sick, who'd trusted his wife completely right up until the moment he died. I thought about the funeral, where Samantha had sobbed so convincingly that even I had felt sorry for her. "She ruined her own life the moment she decided to cheat on my son," I'd told James. "I'm just making sure everyone knows about it." The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I'd worn to Michael's funeral. I wanted Samantha to see me and remember that day, remember how she'd cried on my shoulder while planning her future with another man. As I walked into the courthouse, I felt Michael's presence beside me. My son had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be. Today, I was going to do the right thing for both of us. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sickly. Samantha sat at the plaintiff's table in a conservative black suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a somber bun. She'd perfected the look of a grieving widow seeking justice. Judge Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been handling family court cases for over 20 years. She had the tired expression of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human greed and family dysfunction. Patricia Grimm opened with a performance worthy of an Oscar. She painted me as a bitter old woman who'd manipulated her dying son, preyed on his fears about mortality, and convinced him to disinherit his loving wife. She presented evidence of my Sunday visits, my inappropriate comments about Samantha's spending habits, and my suspicious knowledge of Michael's financial affairs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grimm concluded, gesturing dramatically toward the judge, "Dorothy Mitchell saw an opportunity to steal her son's legacy from the woman he chose to marry. She exploited Michael's brief moment of vulnerability after his diagnosis to rewrite his will in her favor. This is nothing less than elder abuse in reverse, a mother taking advantage of her own child." It was a compelling narrative. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed it myself. James's opening was quieter, more methodical. He focused on facts. Michael's mental competency, the legitimacy of his estate planning decisions, the absence of any evidence that I'd coerced him in any way. He painted Michael as a thoughtful man who'd made carefully considered changes to his will for reasons that would become clear. "Your Honor," James concluded, "Michael Mitchell was not a victim of manipulation. He was a man who discovered something about his marriage that fundamentally changed how he wanted to distribute his assets. The evidence will show that his decisions were not only rational, but necessary." That got Samantha's attention. I saw her lean forward and whisper urgently to her lawyer, who shook her head dismissively. They had no idea what was coming. The first witness was Dr. Peterson, Michael's endocrinologist, who testified that my son's diabetes was well controlled and had no impact on his cognitive function. Patricia Grimm tried to suggest that the diagnosis itself might have caused emotional distress, but Dr. Peterson shut that down quickly. "Mr. Mitchell was actually relieved to finally have an explanation for his symptoms," she testified. "He was optimistic about his treatment plan and showed no signs of depression or anxiety." Next came Michael's estate planning attorney, who confirmed that my son had seemed completely rational and purposeful when updating his will. "He specifically requested that the changes be kept confidential," the lawyer testified. "He said he wanted to protect his family from unnecessary stress." Protect his family. My heart ached thinking about Michael trying to shield me from the truth about Samantha, even as he planned for the worst. When it was our turn to present evidence, James started with the phone records. Patricia Grimm objected immediately, claiming they were irrelevant to the question of the will's validity. But Judge Morrison allowed them, and I watched Samantha's face go pale as James read the dates and times of her calls to Carlos Rodriguez. These records show a pattern of communication between Mrs. Samantha Mitchell and Mr. Carlos Rodriguez beginning 8 months before Michael Mitchell's death, James explained. The frequency and timing of these communications suggest a relationship that predates the will changes by several months. Samantha was whispering frantically to her lawyer now, her careful composure cracking. Patricia Grimm called for a recess, claiming she needed to review the new evidence, but Judge Morrison denied the request. "We'll proceed," the judge said firmly. "Mr. Worthington, do you have additional evidence to present?" James smiled. "Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to enter into evidence a video recording that shows Mrs. Mitchell's relationship with Mr. Rodriguez the night before her husband's funeral." That's when Samantha made her fatal mistake. During the brief pause as James set up the video equipment, she leaned over to me and hissed, "I'm going to leave you with nothing, you useless old hag." I held up my phone and asked the judge, "Your Honor, may I play a video of her from last night?" Judge Morrison's eyebrows shot up at my question, and I had to suppress a smile. Samantha looked confused, probably wondering what video I could possibly have from last night. Poor thing had no idea I was talking about Tyler's drone footage from 8 months ago. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge said carefully, "are you suggesting you have additional evidence?" "Indeed I do, Your Honor." I handed my phone to James, who connected it to the courtroom's display system. This video was taken the evening before my son's funeral. The footage began playing on the large screen. Even with the grainy night vision quality, there was no mistaking what we were seeing. Samantha in my backyard, locked in a passionate embrace with Carlos Rodriguez while her husband lay in a funeral home across town. The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Samantha's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally desperate calculation. "That's not what it looks like," she blurted out, jumping to her feet. "Carlos was just comforting me. I was distraught about the funeral arrangements." Judge Morrison raised her hand for silence. "Mrs. Mitchell, please sit down. Mr. Worthington, can you establish the authenticity and source of this recording?" James nodded. "Your Honor, this video was captured by a neighbor's drone camera. We have the original footage, complete with metadata showing the date, time, and GPS coordinates. The neighbor who recorded it is available to testify if needed." Poor Tyler was probably in math class right now, having no idea his drone hobby had just blown up a legal case. I made a mental note to buy that boy the biggest gift card to the electronics store I could find. Patricia Grimm was frantically shuffling papers, clearly trying to regroup. "Your Honor, this video proves nothing about the validity of the will. My client's personal relationships after her husband's death are irrelevant to whether Mrs. Dorothy Mitchell manipulated her son." "After?" James interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Grimm, this video was taken before the funeral, not after. And as we established with the phone records, this relationship began months before Michael Mitchell's death." The judge studied the timestamp on the screen. "The recording shows 11:47 p.m. on March 15th. When was the funeral, Mr. Worthington?" "March 16th at 2:30 p.m., Your Honor, less than 14 hours later." Judge Morrison's expression hardened as she turned to Samantha. "Mrs. Mitchell, you were engaged in what appears to be an intimate relationship with another man the night before burying your husband?" Samantha opened her mouth, then closed it, looking like a fish gasping for air. Finally, she managed, "I was vulnerable, grieving. Carlos was just being supportive." "Supportive?" I couldn't help myself. The word came out with enough sarcasm to frost the windows. Judge Morrison shot me a warning look, but I caught a hint of amusement in her eyes. The momentum had shifted completely. What had started as Samantha's attack on my character had become an exposé of her own lies. James pressed the advantage, introducing Carlos Rodriguez's insurance expertise and the convenient timing of Michael's estate planning changes. By the time we broke for lunch, Samantha looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 hours. During the lunch recess, I watched Samantha huddle with her legal team in the courthouse hallway. She was gesticulating wildly, her carefully constructed widow's facade completely shattered. Patricia Grimm looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "Dorothy," James said quietly, as we sat in his car sharing sandwiches, "they're going to try to separate the adultery from the will contest. Grimm will argue that even if Samantha was unfaithful, it doesn't prove you manipulated Michael. But it explains why he changed the will," I pointed out. "He found out about the affair. We need to prove that. Can you think of anything, any conversation, any change in Michael's behavior in those final weeks?" I'd been thinking about this for months. Michael had been different in his last few visits, more thoughtful, almost melancholy. He'd spent extra time looking through old photo albums, asking questions about his father and our early marriage. At the time, I'd attributed it to the diabetes diagnosis, making him contemplative about mortality. He kept asking about trust, I remembered suddenly. How I knew I could trust his father, how you tell when someone really loves you versus when they're just playing a role. James made notes on his legal pad. Anything else? He brought me his grandmother's jewelry box 2 weeks before he died, said he wanted me to have it for safekeeping. At the time, I thought it was sweet, but now it seems like he was moving assets out of Samantha's reach, James finished. Dorothy, I think your son knew exactly what was happening. The question is, can we prove it? When court resumed, Patricia Grimm came out swinging. She called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Samantha's therapist, who testified about her patient's genuine grief and emotional distress following the diabetes diagnosis. She painted Samantha as a devoted wife struggling with her husband's potential mortality. Mrs. Mitchell came to me because she was having difficulty processing her husband's diagnosis, Dr. Walsh testified. She was terrified of losing him and felt guilty for those fears. It was a clever strategy. Reframe the affair as a consequence of grief rather than a cause of Michael's actions. But James was ready. Dr. Walsh, he said during cross-examination, when did Mrs. Mitchell first come to see you? Approximately 4 months before her husband's death. And during your sessions, did she ever mention feeling suspicious about her husband's behavior? Concerned that he might be hiding something from her? Dr. Walsh hesitated. Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific session content in detail. But you can confirm whether such concerns were raised? Yes, she did express some anxiety about her husband's secretiveness regarding financial matters. There it was. Samantha had been worried that Michael was onto her, had been trying to get ahead of his suspicions by playing the concerned wife role. James introduced phone records showing that Samantha had actually increased her contact with Carlos Rodriguez in the weeks following her first therapy sessions. Instead of working on her marriage, she doubled down on her affair. By the end of the day, what remained of Samantha's credibility was hanging by a thread, but the best was yet to come. Carlos Rodriguez looked exactly like what he was, a middle-aged insurance salesman who'd gotten in way over his head. When the bailiff called his name, he walked to the witness stand like a man approaching his own execution. James had subpoenaed him after discovering his role in the whole scheme. Patricia Grimm had objected strenuously, but Judge Morrison was clearly interested in hearing the full story. Mr. Rodriguez, James began, how long have you known Samantha Mitchell? About 2 years, Carlos answered, his voice barely above a whisper. And how did you meet? She came to my office to discuss increasing her husband's life insurance coverage. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was worse than I'd imagined. When was this initial meeting? October 2022. Carlos glanced nervously at Samantha, who was staring at the table in front of her. So, approximately 8 months before Michael Mitchell's death, your first professional contact with his wife was her wanting to increase his life insurance? Yes, sir. James let that sink in before continuing. What was the current coverage amount at that time? $200,000. And what amount did Mrs. Mitchell want to increase it to? Carlos squirmed in his seat. $800,000. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Morrison rapped her gavel for order, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. An $800,000 motive for murder was nothing to sneeze at. Did Mr. Mitchell agree to this increase? Initially, yes. But then he came to my office about 6 weeks before his death, wanting to make changes. What kind of changes? He wanted to reduce the coverage back to the original amount and change the beneficiary structure. The pieces were falling into place like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Michael had discovered the affair, realized what Samantha was planning, and moved to protect his assets. Did he explain why he wanted these changes? Carlos nodded miserably. He said he'd learned some things about his wife that made him reconsider his estate planning. He seemed hurt, angry, but trying to hide it. Did you process these changes? Yes, sir. The new policy reflected a 50-50 split between his wife and his mother with the reduced coverage amount. Samantha's head snapped up at this. She'd clearly been expecting the full $800,000, not knowing that Michael had outmaneuvered her months before his death. Patricia Grimm tried to salvage something during her cross-examination. focusing on Carlos's obvious affair with a married woman and suggesting his testimony was tainted by guilt. But the damage was done. "Mr. Rodriguez," she asked, "isn't it true that you pursued a relationship with Mrs. Mitchell because you knew about the insurance policy?" It was a desperate gambit, but Carlos surprised everyone by shaking his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Samantha pursued me. She said her marriage was over, that her husband was controlling and suspicious. She made it sound like she was trapped." "And you believed her?" Carlos looked directly at Samantha for the first time since taking the stand. "I wanted to believe her. But looking back, I think she targeted me specifically because of my access to insurance information. The man wasn't as stupid as he looked. It had just taken him 8 months to figure out he was being used." That evening, James called with news that changed everything I thought I knew about my son's final months. "Dorothy, you need to sit down for this," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "I've been going through Michael's personal effects that the insurance company returned, and I found something extraordinary." "What kind of something?" "A letter, addressed to you, dated 2 days before his death. It was hidden in his briefcase, sealed in an envelope marked, 'To be opened only if something happens to me.'" My hands started shaking. "Read it to me. Dorothy, it's 11 pages long. I'm coming over." James arrived 30 minutes later with a manila envelope and the most serious expression I'd ever seen on his face. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Michael and I had shared so many Sunday dinners, and James spread out the pages. "Your son was a remarkable man," he said quietly, "and he loved you very much." The letter was handwritten in Michael's careful script, the same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for 35 years. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and I'm no longer here to protect you from what I've discovered about Samantha." James read slowly, pausing occasionally to let the words sink in. Michael had known about the affair for 2 months before his death. He'd hired a private investigator, collected evidence, and planned his response carefully. "I can't prove that Samantha is planning to hurt me, but I can't ignore the evidence either. The increased insurance policy, her relationship with Carlos Rodriguez, her sudden interest in my will and estate planning. It's too convenient to be coincidental." The letter detailed everything: Samantha's affair, her financial motivations, her manipulation of both Michael and Carlos. But most importantly, it revealed my son's strategy. "I've changed my will and insurance policies to protect you, Mom. If something happens to me, Samantha will get enough to maintain her lifestyle for a while, but not enough to retire with her boyfriend. I want you to have the house, the investment accounts, and the peace of mind that comes with financial security." Tears were streaming down my face by the time James reached the final paragraph. "I know this will be hard for you to read, Mom. I know you'll blame yourself for not seeing through Samantha's act sooner. But please don't. She's a skilled manipulator who fooled me for years. What matters now is that you're protected. Use the resources I'm leaving you to live the life you deserve. And if Samantha tries to contest my will, give this letter to James Worthington. Tell him I trusted him to take care of you when I no longer could." James set the letter down and removed his glasses, wiping his eyes. "Dorothy, your son basically solved his own case from beyond the grave." I stared at the pages covered in Michael's familiar handwriting, feeling a mixture of grief and pride that threatened to overwhelm me. My baby boy had spent his final weeks protecting me instead of confronting his cheating wife. He'd chosen strategy over confrontation, planning over passion. "James," I said when I could finally speak, "we're presenting this letter in court tomorrow, aren't we?" "Absolutely. This proves Michael was mentally competent, acting on reliable information, and making rational decisions about his estate. It destroys any argument about undue influence or manipulation. But more than that, it proved something else. My son had loved me enough to sacrifice his own peace of mind to ensure mine. Even facing betrayal and possible danger, he'd spent his final weeks thinking about my future instead of his own fear. Tomorrow, Samantha would learn that she'd underestimated both the men in the Mitchell family. The final day of the hearing arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that makes you grateful to be alive. I dressed in Michael's favorite color, deep purple, and pinned his father's American flag lapel pin to my jacket. Today wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about honoring my son's final wishes. Samantha looked haggard when she walked into the courtroom, her designer clothes wrinkled and her makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. Carlos was conspicuously absent from the gallery, having apparently decided his testimony was quite enough involvement for one lifetime. Judge Morrison called the court to order, and James stood to present our final piece of evidence. Your Honor, we'd like to enter into evidence a letter written by Michael Mitchell 2 days before his death, addressed to his mother and clearly stating his intentions regarding his estate planning. Patricia Grimm objected immediately, claiming the letter was hearsay and potentially fabricated, but a handwriting expert James had consulted overnight confirmed its authenticity. Judge Morrison allowed it into evidence. As James read Michael's letter aloud, I watched Samantha's face cycle through shock, fear, and finally resignation. She'd built her case on the assumption that Michael had been manipulated by me, never imagining that he'd been 2 steps ahead of her all along. The letter destroyed every argument she'd made. Michael hadn't been confused or coerced. He'd been protecting his family from a woman he'd discovered was dangerous. His estate planning changes weren't the result of undue influence. They were the careful strategy of a man who'd realized his wife was planning his financial destruction, if not worse. Your Honor, James concluded, this letter proves beyond any doubt that Michael Mitchell was acting rationally, with full knowledge of the facts, and with a clear understanding of his own wishes. The will changes were not only valid, but necessary. Patricia Grimm's closing argument was perfunctory at best. She tried to suggest the letter was motivated by paranoia or depression, but the evidence painted a picture of a careful, methodical man protecting his assets from a woman who'd betrayed him completely. Judge Morrison retired to her chambers for less than an hour. When she returned, her expression left no doubt about her decision. In the matter of the estate of Michael Mitchell, I find no evidence of undue influence, mental incapacity, or fraudulent manipulation. The will dated 6 weeks before Mr. Mitchell's death is valid and will be enforced as written. She paused, her gaze settling on Samantha with unmistakable distaste. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential insurance fraud and conspiracy charges. Mrs. Samantha Mitchell, you are advised to retain criminal counsel. The gavel came down with the finality of justice served. Samantha fled the courtroom without looking back, her dreams of easy money and life with Carlos Rodriguez crumbling around her. I later learned she was arrested 3 weeks later on charges of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. Carlos cooperated with investigators and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. As for me, I inherited everything Michael had wanted me to have: the house, the investments, and most importantly, the knowledge that my son had loved me enough to spend his final weeks ensuring my security. I still live in Michael's house, surrounded by his books and the garden he planted for me. Every Sunday, I make dinner for one and remember the man who called me every week for 35 years. The dining room table seems too big now, but I keep his chair exactly where he left it. Sometimes Carlos Rodriguez's wife calls to thank me for exposing the affair that destroyed her marriage, but ultimately saved her from a man with flexible morals and expensive tastes. Sometimes Tyler stops by to show me new drone footage of migrating birds or spectacular sunsets. His video changed both our lives, though he probably doesn't fully understand that yet. I'm 71 now, financially secure, and finally free from the manipulation and drama that defined the last years of Michael's life. My son's final gift wasn't just the inheritance, it was the truth that set us both free. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.